I wanted to thank everybody for coming today. For those who I have not yet met, my name is Aaron Stein. I'm the president and CEO of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Have been since April 15th. So if I haven't met you yet, please do say hello after, where we can continue the reception that we were all attending for the past half an hour. I'm not going to be introducing our speaker. I will leave that to Mike Beckley, who runs our Asia program here. All I will say is that if this is your first time here and you are interested in learning more about FPRI, you can take out your phone, you can flip open your camera, and you can scan that QR code to learn more about the organization. And the reason why I'm also doing that is this is now a perfect time to get your phone and turn it off, so that we don't have I guess a cell phone interruption into our speakers. Put it on airplane mode. We've learned that with the feedback. And so with that, I wanted to thank you all for coming. If you have not already signed up to our email list, please do. We are doing these more and more often, and we'd like to see you all in the office. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to do the formal introductions.
Thanks, Aaron. In the entire time I've been at FPRI, this is the event I've been most excited about, because I think that our guest here, Dmitri Alperovitch, has written the best book on what we're going to call Cold War II between the United States and its allies and Russia and China. I'll explain why I think this book is so great in a second. But first, I really need to introduce this guy, because this is a truly impressive person. Dmitri was born in the Soviet Union. When he was 11, he lived through the collapse of that superpower. And a few years later, he moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee, as one does after. And he got to work pretty quickly. He started his first company when he was still in high school in Tennessee. It was an encryption company that was focused on secure communications. After graduating from Georgia Tech with a degree in cybersecurity, which was the first such degree awarded. It wasn't a popular thing like it is now. Now I have lots of students who do that, but he was the trendsetter. He worked for CipherTrust and McAfee, and then he struck out on his own, and he co-founded CrowdStrike, which I don't use this. This is not hyperbolic to say it revolutionized the cybersecurity industry, because he exposed rampant Chinese state-sponsored espionage before it was cool to do so. He also investigated the Russian hack of the Democrats, which you might have heard about in 2016. His work has been so influential that quotes that I've used, like in lectures and talks, that I had no idea where they came from, quotes that have been routinely used by the top national security officials in the United States, like the espionage that China has done is the largest transfer of wealth in human history. That comes from him. Also, there's only two types of companies in the world: those that have been hacked by China and those that don't know that they've been hacked by China. I've literally used this in media and had no idea where they came from. It turns out he was the originator. In addition to being a successful entrepreneur, Dmitri has also been a public servant. So he served on the Department of Homeland Security's Advisory Council. He was also a special advisor to the Department of Defense. He recently co-founded Silverado Policy Accelerator, which is a think tank dedicated to advancing American global leadership through practical solutions, not pie in the sky IR theory stuff that I specialize in. If that's not enough, Dmitri has carved out a successful career as a public intellectual. So about a decade ago, Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the 100 leading thinkers in the world. A few years ago, he started a popular podcast called Geopolitics Decanted, which I subscribe to and recommend that you do too. And this year, Dmitri has become a best-selling author with the book that we're going to be talking about here today. It's called World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. So we're going to dig into all the details in a second, but I just want to emphasize that this book, more so than any other book I've read on the topic, kind of takes you into the decision calculus of someone like Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin. And I think it's helped by the fact that Dmitri has spent years in the shadows tracking Chinese and Russian activity in cyberspace, things that you're maybe not reading about in newspapers, but that gave him, I think, special insight into the thinking of these leaders. He also grew up on the other side of the Iron Curtain. That may have also helped. And the book is also just highly informative. So there's a lot of things where, your standard pundit will just kind of like give a phrase and then not really explain the backstory behind it. Something about like Taiwanese unification with the mainland. Whereas in this book, he takes the time to walk you through the historical backdrop of each of these issues. I think the section in particular on the centuries-long history of Taiwan and the great powers that have tried to get control of it and how Chinese control was never really that strong, that is a truly impressive section. And then the book is it's vividly written. So it opens with this vignette of a Chinese assault on Taiwan. It's not the way that most people think it's going to go down. I think that alone is worth the price of admission. So needless to say, I thought it was a pretty good book. So, so the most important message, Dmitri, I took from your book is know your enemy. Know your enemy, because who they are explains what they do and then what you need to do to protect yourself. You pointed out that this simple but very important insight kind of shaped your breakout in cybersecurity, because you tell these companies, look, you don't have a malware problem. You have a nation state problem. And until you recognize that fact, you're not going to be able to solve this problem. And this also then applies to your geopolitical analysis. So my first question is just, who are the Chinese? Are they communists? You know, like Steve Kotkin, this noted scholar of the Soviet Union, he got into the archives at the end of the Cold War and he said the big secret of the Soviet Communist Party is they were communists. Like they actually said the same things behind closed doors as they did in their grand speeches. And he says he thinks the Chinese are the same. Or are the Chinese nationalists? Is this all about the century of humiliation? Are they just gangsters and oligarchs? You know, if you add up the wealth of the top Chinese officials, it's bigger than the GDP of Austria, as far as we know. So, you know, it's working out pretty well for them. Are they just trying to protect them and theirs? What do Chinese leaders believe, and what do they want?
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Aaron, and FPRI. Thank you, Mike, for doing this wonderful introduction. I was blushing throughout, and I have to say, I'm not sure it's the best book, but I hope it's a worthy follow-on to your amazing book, Danger Zone, that you released a few years ago, that really started this whole debate about Taiwan, that I highly recommend to everyone. Look, I actually disagree with Steve Kotkin, and there's a terrific book that just came out by a friend of mine, a Cold War historian, Sergei Radchenko, called To Run the World, where he actually got the most recently declassified files from both the Soviet Union and some even from China. An incredible story of how he got some of those files from China from decades earlier. And the big revelation is actually that the Soviets were never really focused that much on ideology. It was always hard power, concerns about their own security, interest in expansionism, but not really driven by let's get communism out there. And really, that was, in retrospect, somewhat obvious to anyone that watched it very closely, because really from certainly late Khrushchev, early Brezhnev era, they were not interested in spreading communism around the world, right? So this idea that this was such a big ideological confrontation is not really the case. The Chinese, you know, I'm not sure that it's easy to talk about all Chinese leaders, because Xi Jinping, I think, is in a category of its own, and he's the only one, frankly, that matters today, right? He has gotten more power than any Chinese leader, bar none, really, since the emperors. Maybe only Mao, in a very brief period during the Cultural Revolution, had more power than he does, right? He's consolidated the Communist Party to an incredible extent. And if he makes his decision to go after Taiwan, it is his decision and his decision alone, just like it was for Putin with Russia. So who is this man? Well, I do think that he's a Marxist-Leninist in the very traditional sense. I think he does believe fundamentally in that ideology, which you're seeing right now play out in the Chinese economy, because he seems completely uninterested in doing the things that are necessary to make sure that things that really don't go off the cliff, because they've got really fundamental problems. Growth is stagnating, huge bubble in the real estate market. And just to give you a sense of the scale, so in 2008, during our real estate issues, real estate was about 10, 12% of our GDP. Today, real estate is 30% of GDP of China. Just enormous bubble. And so much of it is these ghost cities, unproductive real estate that's not worth a whole lot, and has dramatic ramifications for the government, because the provinces in China, the state governments, they are financed by sale of land to developers. Well, if developers are not buying land, there's no taxes coming in. We've got real fundamental issues impacting their social net and pensions and medical care and the like. And Xi Jinping just seems completely uninterested in trying to, provide stimulus to fix that. He's plugging holes in a few places, make sure things don't go completely off the rails. But we'll see what happens next week when they have the big plenum that's focused on the economics. But he strikes me very similar to Putin in that both of these guys seem bored by economics and want to leave it off to others, but don't really give them that much leeway. I cite this episode in the book where I was talking to someone who's a Russian who had left Russia since the war began, but was very well connected, back 10 years ago, and talked to a lot of people close to the Kremlin. And he's telling me the story of how in 2014, when Putin wanted to take Crimea, he got resistance from the economic leadership, the central banker, Ministry of Finance, and they were telling him this would be a disaster for Russia if we do this. Sanctions, the export controls, they'll ruin our economy. And Putin basically said, listen, my job is to expand Russian power. Your job is to manage the economy. You do your job, I'll do mine. And I think that Xi thinks very much in the same way, that he is very much focused on security, internal security, first and foremost, stability of the Communist Party, removing any competition to himself, as he has done very successfully since 2012. And then, to borrow a phrase, focus on making China great again, right? Which I think Putin is also very interested in that traditional hardcore nationalist way. And that means making it more powerful on the world stage, making its military more powerful. And I think it ultimately means taking Taiwan, which he calls the cornerstone of Chinese nation's rejuvenation, right? And, not to go too deep into history, you should read the book for that, but the 100-year history of humiliation, as the Chinese call it, from the Opium Wars and the unequal treaties with Japan, ultimately taking Taiwan and Hong Kong going to the British, is imprinted in Chinese psyche, not just Xi Jinping, but really, most of the Chinese nation. And for many decades predating Xi, they've been focused on achieving the national rejuvenation by 2040s, the 100-year anniversary of the establishment of the country. And Xi has become more impatient, right? He's saying we shouldn't wait. And particularly on the issue of Taiwan, he said on many occasions that we should not leave this issue to future generations. We have to solve it now. Well, he, like Putin, is now in his 70s. So when he's talking about future generations, he's not talking about decades, right? And as I say in the book, I think that period between 2028 and 2032, I think is going to be the most dangerous period, potentially of the century. And that is because in 2027, he's likely to get reelected to the next term. He has given an order to the Chinese military to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. I don't think he invades in 27. We can go into why. But in late 2028, I think the window does open up. And I think it closes, at least in his mind, in 2032, because that will be the end of his term. And he'll be 79 at that point. Unlike perhaps our system, they don't tend to elect their leaders into their 80s. And beyond that, he will be thinking about mortality issues, etc. And he wants to be the one to do this. I think it's very clear in that way. He's very similar to Putin. He wants to take credit for it. And get too long into the 2030s, you start thinking about, you might die, you might be out of power, but also it gets more difficult, right? And the window really starts closing in because, in large part, that window is opening because the United States, Taiwan, Japan, we've all let our eye off the ball, right? For the last 2 decades, we've been fighting these wars in the Middle East, focus on other things. And the Chinese have been building a military for one mission and one mission only, which is to take Taiwan. And the balance of power has started to shift for the first time, right? Since the establishment of the People's Republic of China, they're getting close, not yet there, to being able to do this. And that window will close because the United States is making investments, Japan is making investments, Taiwan is making investments, Australia is making investments. We started to do this a few years ago when we realized this was a big issue, right around the time of your book. And the problem, of course, is that it takes time to build submarines, to build missiles, to build all this capacity. But if you get into the 2030s and 2040s, a lot of that capacity starts coming in line. Things like AUKUS, our partnership with Australia and UK, to jointly build submarines and the like. So you will lose that window of opportunity militarily first and foremost, and then of course his own view on his longevity and power. And that's why I think this period is very good.
I'm wondering how inevitable this was. In other words, was there a lost chance? Because I get dictator wants Taiwan. He's in his 70s. You know, China's economy is not doing great. Better now than later. But you know, if the ultimate goal is to make China great again, it seemed like China for a long time had a good thing going. I mean, they were growing very rapidly. The United States was almost going out of its way to pour investment and transfer technology to them and shepherd them into the WTO. Meanwhile, the US-Japan alliance keeps Japan on a leash, and Americans are telling the Taiwanese not to rock the boat. So it seemed like China could have ridden that wave longer and basically taken over more of East Asia without firing a shot through a sort of manifest destiny approach. And yet you show in this book, I think extremely well, that China kind of went on a Cold War footing probably more than a decade ago, maybe even 2 decades ago. I mean, they've been thinking of the United States as an enemy. We now have translated documents of Jiang Zemin and other leaders that we thought were nice, saying that the Americans are their #1 enemy. And so, well, I guess
Deng Xiaoping, by the way.
Deng Xiaoping, World War III without Gunsmoke. You know, he thought the United States planned the Tiananmen Square protest, you know, to unseat the CCP.
He was Russian when the Cold War ended, right?
Yeah, it's the risk. So, but my question is why though? Why? Like the Russia resentment I get because Putin lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union. He was, you know, famously, you know, in East Germany burning documents. So that humiliation is recent and it's visceral. For the Chinese, the century of humiliation was a long time ago, and they could have crafted a different historical narrative that didn't require them to go on this vengeance mission. And for Xi Jinping's adult life, there's been this steady rise of economic development in China. So I guess my question is, what was there some point at which China could have gone in a different direction? Really always kind of headed for this reckoning, simply because at the end of the day, any Chinese leader is going to want Taiwan. Taiwan seems to be slipping away, and so now they can start using sticks to bring it back out of the pool.
I think it was likely inevitable. And look, you didn't need classified documents to know that, right? Deng Xiaoping's very public guidance to the Chinese people was hide your strength, bide your time. And for some reason, no one bothered to ask, who are you hiding your strength from? And what are you biding your time for, right? In retrospect, it was very obvious. And we chose to ignore it. It's not like, you know, we didn't know. All the signs were there. We pretended, oh, you know, let's trade with them, let's engage with them economically, and they'll liberalize and they'll become a Jeffersonian democracy, and you know all the things we thought about Russia, right? That was of course nonsense. Played out the same way in China, a catastrophic mistake. But look, Xi Jinping threw that all out the window and said, "I want this now. I don't want to wait." If they had waited, you're absolutely right. Things would have been so much worse for us, right? I actually joked that Xi Jinping, if he's not an American agent, we should put him on the payroll, because everything he's done to China has been to the detriment of China and to the benefit of us. The wolf warrior diplomacy that has upset every one of the people in the region and many others, the mismanagement of the economy, the aggressiveness against Japan, against the Philippines, that has turned these countries into much closer allies of us than they've ever been. Now, this only works up until right, but he's woken us up, right? He's woken up the great power, and that is probably his biggest mistake. And you know, now there is a race: who will build up capability, us for deterrence or him for invasion, and will this take place? But I do think that the 100-year century of humiliation is not that long ago in the Chinese nation's history of 5,000 years. All of them know it very well. They study it in schools. It's, you know, ingrained in them that these, you know, colonialist powers have tried to divide us and tear Hong Kong away from us, and Taiwan and so forth. So they feel it very viscerally. And also they know, which most of the Western world has forgotten, that for much of human history, China was the #1 nation in the world. It was the most populous, the richest, the most powerful. And only since the advent of the Industrial Revolution that they lose that place, first to Europe and now to America. So they view this as reemerging to their rightful place in the world, being the #1 power. I mean, I don't blame them. I'd feel the same way, right? And this is where I quibble with the premise of your question, because if you take that view that we are going to be the #1 superpower in the world, then simply growing your economy is not enough, because their geographic position is fundamentally very insecure. Just put yourself in the shoes of China. I have a map in the book that's a little bit untraditional. So, the typical map of the world in China is this huge landmass of China and this little dot next to it that is Taiwan, right? And you might look at that and say, well, why is this relevant? Why should we care about it? Why should China care about it? But if you rotate the map, as I do, and you put China at the top, looking out at the vastness of the Indo-Pacific, this becomes very clear instantly, I think. Because what happens? Well, if you're China, you're looking out at the world. To your east, you see the Korean Peninsula, with half of it being South Korea, with 28,000 American troops there, US Army, air bases, radar installations. Further down, the Japanese islands, headquarters of the 7th Fleet, Marines in Okinawa, the highly capable self-defense forces. Right in the center of that first island chain, facing much of China, many of the Chinese naval ports, is Taiwan, and viewed as an outpost of American power. And then closing down the arc, the Philippines, an American ally, mutual defense treaty, where for the first time in 32 years, we're once again getting access to the Filipino military bases, right? So if you're China, you're completely surrounded. And you're a power that depends highly on imports, oil from the Gulf, food, etc. And your economy is completely dependent on exports. And you cannot put yourself at the mercy of the US Navy, as they do today, where the US Navy could blockade China easily in the Malacca Straits and in the Taiwan Straits, etc. And you can't let that happen if you're going to be the world's biggest power, right? It's unacceptable. And that, I think, is one of the big geopolitical drivers of wanting to take Taiwan. There's a historical one, there's a destiny one, there's an ego one, but you also need that to break through and dominate East Asia, push the US out all the way to the 3rd island chain, Hawaii, and essentially secure your trade routes, which is really what this is about. If you look at the history of the growth of the American superpower, as I do in the book as well, briefly, it traces back to the buildup of the US Navy. And in 1907, Teddy Roosevelt sending the Great White Fleet around the world to visit Japan, go through the Panama Canal, etc., to announce that America has arrived. And for the next 100+ years, the US Navy has secured the trade routes for the American economy, for American consumers, for American exports. That has coincided with the great rise of American superpower and economic power, which has driven our national security. Well, China wants the same, but it can't do that. It can build all the blue water Navy ships that it wants to if it's contained within the South China Sea and East China Sea as it is today, right? And the fundamental problem of their geography is the waters all around their shores are very, very shallow. In the Taiwan Strait, the depth of waters is only 300 feet. Too shallow to even safely put a submarine in without detection. On the other side of Taiwan, on the eastern side, the water depth is 12,000 feet and goes much further down from there. The Pacific is the world's deepest ocean, right? So if you capture Taiwan, if you build submarine bases, surface ship bases on the other side, you can dominate that region. You can project power. You can make the US presence in the Philippines and in Japan unsustainable and make it very dangerous.
Okay, so we're probably going to have a struggle on our hands, and you call it Cold War II, which I like as a phrase intellectually because I think it shows, just like World War II was in part an outgrowth of World War I, so Cold War II is very much related to the original Cold War. I also just like it as an American because I think we're probably pretty good at Cold Wars considering we won the first one. And you explicitly say the American goal has to be to win the Cold War. We can't just manage competition, but we have to actually define a goal and then try to win. And it seems to me your strategy is very similar to the old Kennan playbook of containment, where you basically put them in a headlock, and then the inherent weaknesses of their system will eventually force them to tap out. And I'm not dismissing that. Like I've written in agreement with this exact strategy, but here's the problem, and people have pointed this out to me, is that the Chinese know how Cold War I turned out. And they had a front row seat to the Soviet collapse, and they've made it their prime directive ever since to never let that happen in China. And so when the Americans say, hey, let's have a Cold War again, the Chinese say, oh, so you're going to play the part of the United States again? And does that mean we have to play the part of the Soviet Union? Like, no, thanks. We're not going to do that. We're going to fight this one correctly this time. We're going to learn from the Soviet mistakes. We're not going to do some dumb communist thing. We're going to do state capitalism. We're not going to do, stupid Gorbachev selling out to the West and going soft. No, we're going to unite behind a dictator, and we're going to engage in this Nazi-sized buildup of our military forces. So I think if Xi Jinping were sitting here right now, he'd say, Dmitri, I understand you want to contain us, but we can't be contained. And we're not just going to sit back and let you do your dusty old Kennan playbook that you're blowing the dust off after all these decades. That's not going to work with us, because I'm a student of the Cold War too, and I've been training all of my minions to fight against the exact outcome that you're seeking. So how can we have any confidence that this is going to work a second time around?
Well, first of all, Germany thought that same thing, that they learned the lessons of World War I, and they were never going to lose again, right? It didn't quite work out for them. And the fundamentals matter here. And I believe that China is in a much weaker place than the Soviet Union ever was during the first Cold War, right? That this war should be even easier to win than the first one, because China does not have the ideological attraction that the Soviet Union had. It does not have the system of alliances. It has no allies. We can talk about Russia. Russia is not an ally of China. Neither is Iran, and you don't want an ally like North Korea, frankly. Their military is much smaller than ours in every respect, except in this issue of the weapons rate, right? If you just did a spreadsheet comparison of military capabilities, ours versus China, it's not even close, right? If you had a hypothetical conflict with them, let's say in the Atlantic Ocean, a naval battle, like, we would cream them easily, or a land war in Latin America, right? They couldn't even deliver the troops there. But spreadsheets don't go to war, as my friend Mike Kaufman says, who's a good friend of FPRI's. And they build a capability for this particular fight, and we were distracted with various other things, right? The problem is, in large part, I talk a lot about the problems of our military and defense industrial base. We have insisted on building a military to fight any foe anywhere in the world at any time. The problem is, we just don't have the resources to do that. We don't have the military scale to do that. So we're peanut buttering across a lot of different areas versus focusing, which I think we need to do with China. But to your specific question, I'm convinced that the Chinese believe they're in Cold War, and they believe that since day, at least, if not before. So when I sort of reject even the idea that they don't want to replay the Cold War. Now, I agree that I think they could win the next one, and Neil Ferguson, a historian, is making the argument these days that the Americans are actually the Soviet Union.
This is going to be my next question, actually. So
yeah, I reject that, so I'll leave that for the next question to explain why. But they're fundamentally weak. Their economy is 25% smaller than ours. Their double-digit growth is over, likely permanently, unless a miracle occurs. So their real growth rate today is about 3 to 4%, very similar to ours. So at that rate, they'll never catch up with us. The military is much less capable in every respect, except for this one singular mission. The demographics problems that they face, and you guys wrote about this in the book, are just staggering. They have 1.4 billion people today. By the end of the century, conservative estimates are that they'll have about 550 million. Right? We have never seen a collapse like that and its impact on society in human history. And much of it, by the way, will be older, sicker, etc. All of that will be highly deflationary and impactful on their economic growth. They're not yet feeling the impact of that on their economy, even though the decline has already started, because they're still seeing these huge migrations of people from rural areas into the cities. which is increasing their productivity and compensating for the loss of demographics. But in 2030s, that's going to come to an end. And that's when you're really going to be taken down significantly. So they may not want to play the game, but you can change geography. I don't think they can change demographics. They've tried, haven't succeeded, despite the relaxing of the one-child policy and bringing all kinds of incentives. Putin is trying to do the same thing, is not working. So, just like Hitler thought he could win the Second World War, I don't think that those fundamentals will change things for China if we get our act together, right? This book, despite the headline title, World on the Brink, is actually a very optimistic one, because I argue we have the innovation base, the access to capital, the education system, the immigration attraction that China does not have, the ideas. And we should be able to win this Cold War if we harness the power of this country and if we focus. If we don't, it could go a very different way. I opened the book with a quote from Tolstoy from War or Peace that says, the two most powerful warriors are patience and time. And I do worry a great deal that we're running out of time and we have no patience.
I want to come back to the issue, especially on Taiwan, which you see is a ticking time bomb, essentially. I want to talk a lot about that, but I do want to follow up because you've convinced me that the Chinese are weaker than we think. You also have a chapter called We Are Stronger Than We Think. But as you alluded to, folks like Neil Ferguson have literally said the United States is the Soviet Union at this point. You have the things he cites, obviously internal divisions. We see that with the political polarization. Massive debt. The interest the United States is paying on the debt now is bigger than the defense budget. He says that's a historical signal of a declining civilization. Productivity has been pretty tepid or stagnant for more than a decade now. Now, thank God we have wonderful, energetic leaders to guide us through all of this, but, it looks like a pretty dodgy situation. So, I mean, you mentioned things like the innovation, we're surrounded by friends and fish, amazing geography, 2 oceans, 2 allies. We're the #1 energy producer in the world, innovation. I used to say universities, although we haven't exactly been covering ourselves in glory in recent years. But the key sticking point is it seems to me, is the institutions and the society itself. And in particular, one thing that Neil and others have pointed out is the sagging morale in the United States. I'm going to give you a statistic. So in 1998, 70% of Americans said patriotism was very important to them. In 2023, that number is down to 38%. And for adults under 30, it's only 23%. So in other words, less than 1 in 4 young Americans says love of country is important to them. And you've seen with the divisions, and I've seen with the protests on my own campus, it just seems like there's a declining sense of civic duty among the American population. And then you see the political class engaging in, I don't even know what to call it. So convince me that we will use all of the great tools that we have to wage this Cold War effectively.
Yeah. Well, first of all, on the debt issue, and debt is a big problem, right? And we got to get it solved. But if you want to compare debt to GDP ratio here versus China, it's 3x over there. So, let's not get, again, we're competing against them and they're much worse. Divisions, absolutely a huge problem. But is it as bad as the Civil War? Is it as bad as the Vietnam War? Is it as bad as the Civil Rights Movement divisions in this country? We've been through way worse than this. By the way, 2 of those examples I've just cited were the first Cold War, and we still won, right? So I think that this doomsday scenarios that people cite are just not realistic. I have a lot of faith in this country. I tend to see that immigrants to this country have a lot more faith in it than native-born Americans for one reason or another. And look, let me just give you a very concrete example. Every single day until maybe last couple of weeks this year, you've had about 4,000 Chinese nationals that have been trying to cross the southern border. Now, I don't think that's a great thing because we need a secure border and we need, I think, a skills-based immigration process and so forth. And I think some of those people that are coming over are undoubtedly agents of Chinese intelligence trying to infiltrate this country. But I think the vast majority of those 4,000 per day are just people looking for a better place for themselves, right? As are many that are coming across from other nations as well. There's no one that's jumping over the fence to go to China. except the North Koreans, and even they are using it as a transit point to South Korea, right? The attractiveness of this country, despite all those divisions, is still unmistakable, right? Everyone still wants to come here. You know, I was just in Europe, and people are like interested from Europe to come here because Europe is such a basket case, right? So yes, we've got problems. Yes, we've got to work on them, but this is still the place where you can build a company like CrowdStrike, now part of the S&P 500, by the way, 8,000 employees, where you can raise capital, where you have incredible innovation-based education. Yeah, problems around universities, absolutely. Where did Xi Jinping send his daughter to study? Harvard, right? Who is going over to Chinese universities to study? No one except people that really want to learn Mandarin, right? And much fewer of them today than ever. Who wants to study physics, computer science, you know, any biotech? They come here, nowhere else, right? So we need to get a reality check. Yes, we have problems. We've always had problems. I mean, the divisions in this country, at the founding of this country, when, you know, we're in the city of Benjamin Franklin, his own son was a loyalist fighting on behalf of the crown, right? And they never spoke again when the revolution broke out, right? So things have been much worse for us over many periods of our society. When faced an external enemy, we've tended to come together and unify. And you're seeing that play out in some ways right now in DC with China, where, you know, two parties can't agree on a single thing except one, China. And the only bipartisan bills that you've seen passed in the last 4 years, like the Chips and Science Act, were bills that were basically labeled as anti-China bills. So I'm very bullish. Look, lots of problems. We can't waste time. But even the China policy of Donald Trump and China policy of Joe Biden, incredible continuity. I quibble with the velocity, but not the direction of those policies.
Okay, well, your points about immigrants and dynamism in the U.S. reminds me of that quote from P.J. O'Rourke, where he said something like, outside of every U.S. embassy, there's two things. There's a giant anti-American protest, and there's a giant line of people waiting to get their green cards, burning the American flag as they're waiting in line for their green card. And you know, this actually leads me to another question, which, you know, you are kind of an embodiment of successful immigration policy, and one of the reasons why American demographics are way better than Chinese over the long run. And you're an example of how immigration makes America strong and why the United States is the kind of special place that you just talked about. But your work in espionage also shows the danger of an open system. And one thing about the Cold War is, you know, the Soviets, say what you will, but they had this wonderful thing where they walled themselves off. And so we didn't have to worry about all the different ways they were infiltrating beyond just.
Did not work very well for them, though.
Didn't work very well. But see, that the difference is the Chinese are ensconced throughout our system, and we have private companies that very much want to make a profit doing business with China. We have allies that want to make a profit with China, and we've benefited tremendously from Chinese immigration, but we also have to worry about espionage. And so how do you think about that problem in fighting Cold War II, where we can't just rely on the other side to completely wall themselves off? They are so ensconced in the global economy. How do you balance the need to be open to the good stuff like the human capital, the investment, but also guard against the espionage that you've tracked for so long?
First of all, we need immigration to this country. If we didn't have immigration to this country since the 1970s, we would have the decline of population since then. And that has direct economic impacts. So talk about demographics collapse. We would be experiencing that if it weren't for immigration. What we can't have is uncontrolled immigration. And Scott Galloway, professor at NYU, had a great line that I signed in the book, that every single year there's a draft for the best talent in the world, and America gets the first pick. Except we don't use it, right? Because we don't have a merit-based immigration program. I'm here by luck because my dad was able to get a job in Chattanooga and came here on a work visa and ultimately was able to get a green card. But there's no way easily to come to this country unless you're able to get a job. And I think that's ridiculous. That we should be, you know, the best way to defeat our adversaries, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, is to take their best people and have them come here and be productive members of our society and have them lose those people, right? So we need to reform immigration. You know, of course, I'm not in favor for anyone comes, you know, unvetted and so forth. But if you've got a process and you check, you know, do all the security checks, etc., you're not going to catch everyone. So you're gonna have to accept that there will be espionage. Espionage is, second to the oldest profession in the world. Now with cyber, you have even less reliance on human intelligence because you can do it remotely. Still need humans as well, but potentially less dependent on it. And the benefit though that you would get far outweighs. And I work with a lot of amazing people in the US government. They're Chinese nationals. We get so much out of them. Language, knowledge of the system, etc. Right? I think it far outweighs any downside.
Okay, well, I think you've restored some of my optimism that we are going to prevail in Cold War II, but you've also scared
We can. I'm not saying we will.
that it's likely but not guaranteed. But you've also scared me that we're going to get shellacked in World War III because we have this coming Chinese assault on Taiwan. And while we could mobilize in a big way, we're not. I mean, current U.S. defense spending, I think, is at like 1994 levels as a share of the economy. And obviously, a lot of our forces are very vulnerable there. So you've talked about how we need to kind of slam shut that door of vulnerability there with a really quick mobilization in and around the Taiwan Strait. And I agree with that. But one thing that people pointed out is, okay, how do you avoid basically pushing China over the brink by doing that? How can you mobilize while at the same time not catalyzing the exact conflict that you're doing? And people bring up, for example, Imperial Japan, when we tried to choke out their economy and they said, okay, we'll do Pearl Harbor. How do you avoid something like that? Or is it just there is no way to avoid it and the best we can do now is just go all in on the deterrence angle and forget any hope of reassuring the Chinese that they should be able to kick this can down the road any further?
So first of all, a lot to unpack in that question. This share of GDP argument on military spending, I just don't buy. I think absolute spending is what matters, not share of GDP, because by the way, when you have a recession and GDP contracts, doesn't mean you pull back on military spending to keep at some magical percentage target. Don't buy that. $900 billion that we spend roughly on our military is an enormous amount. And frankly, you could do a lot better than we were doing for that money, right? The waste that we have is just absolutely insane.
Are you saying that $900 hammer wasn't worth it to Dmitri?
Yeah, I mean, even just outside of those types of issues, the things that we're buying are completely mismatched for A, the mission, because we're trying to do it all and not focused, and two, are the wrong things because we've become too enamored with highly exquisite, highly capable weapons platforms that cost too much for us to actually use, right, and buy in high quantities, right? I'll give you a couple examples. The most egregious, the Ford aircraft carrier. Now, aircraft carriers are important. Anyone that tells you that we don't need aircraft carriers, that the era of aircraft carriers is done because they're more vulnerable to anti-ship missiles and ballistic missiles that China has developed, doesn't know what they're talking about, because aircraft carriers have always been vulnerable. Look at World War II when we lost a bunch, right? There are ways to defend them. There are ways to utilize them in a smart way. From a power projection perspective, there is nothing like them to deliver multiple air wings of US naval power next to the shores of a country. That scares the bejesus out of anyone where that shows up. Very, very important. We've had the Nimitz class aircraft carriers, the last iteration that we were purchasing for about $4 billion. Those aircraft carriers to this day are the best in the world. China has aircraft carriers, tiny in comparison, much less capable. Look, I mean, Russia doesn't even have an aircraft carriers. They have a cruiser that's kind of an aircraft carrier, but half the time spent is in maintenance, actually more than half the time.
Which is on fire.
So, you look at the French, you look at the British, like no one even compares to the Nimitz. $4 billion. We said, we need to do better because we always want to be on the cutting edge. Let's buy the Ford class. That one is nearly 14 billion. I guarantee you we're not getting 3.5 times the value for our money. And how many can we buy with the debt, with the spending at 14 billion? Why couldn't we just say, let's stick with the Nimitz, 4 billion? Good deal. No, we have to spend more. The F-35, an incredible plane, better than anyone else's in the world. But you had Chairman Brown of the Joint Chiefs just say that we need a new plane because the F-35 is like a Ferrari and you don't take out a Ferrari every day. It's too expensive to use. Are you kidding me? We have spent $1 trillion on the F-35 and you don't want to take it out every day? That's insane. We got to get back to the basics. We've had this problem, and I think a lot of it actually, I mean, yes, there's waste and so forth, but a lot of it actually comes from jointness. And I'm in favor of jointness. This is the Goldwater-Nichols Act in the 1980s that basically forced the services to function more together. And at a tactical level, training level, that's been good. On the procurement side, it's been a disaster because we've ended up with these weapons platforms that are built by committee. The F-35, Air Force wanted a plane. The Marines came in and said, and the Navy, well, we want to use the same plane. Let's build one that takes off from aircraft carriers vertically. Let's, do the missions that the Marines want to do. And suddenly you have this monstrosity that costs you $1 trillion, right, as a program, right? Get back to the basics of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Crank things out at scale because quality has a quantity of its own. And when you can't afford to buy these things in large numbers, it doesn't matter how powerful they are and capable. You're going to be outmatched, right? So we need to revert back to that model, and that's really critical. And I'm sorry, I lost the train of thought in the rest of the question because that
was excellent. And, I've been monopolizing this conversation. We have about 15 minutes left, so I want to open it up to questions that you might have. So Christine has some microphones and can pass them around. I see one in the back there. I'll start in the front and we'll move to the back. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. It was great listening to you. I have a question about in the past maybe couple of decades, there was a policy of pivoting from the Middle East to the East Asia. Whatever happened to that policy?
Well, so you had this pivot to Asia that was announced by President Obama in, I think, 2011. And as soon as he announced it, you had the emergence of ISIS in the Middle East that dragged us back there. Then you had Crimea and Russia and Ukraine that preoccupied us with that. And even the Biden administration came in and said, we're really going to do this pivot. We're ready. What happens? 2022, Ukraine, and things divert into a different direction. And, I have a chapter in the book that says, say no to distractions. And as important as it is to say yes to friends, and there's a chapter on that as well, it is also important to say, here's what we're not going to do, which we're not good at, right? We can't solve every conflict in the world. Now, this is not a argument for isolationism or to abandon Ukraine or anything of the sort, but it's to appreciate the reality of American power. It is not infinite, and we need to get our allies to do more in areas where we can't, and we need to prioritize and accept the imperfect in other areas, because the main thing is to keep the main thing, right, as the saying goes. And I believe the main thing is China. The main thing is preventing a conflict over Taiwan Strait, preventing them from taking Taiwan. Once you've done that, great, knock yourself out with everything else. But everything that we do needs to be put through the context of that lens of this Cold War II with China, and doing other things should be looked at in the context of, does it help or hurt that overall mission? And that's what we did during the first Cold War. It didn't always lead to good results. We made a bunch of mistakes, Vietnam, a coup in Iran, and so forth, including Latin America, terrible things. But overall, we kept our eye on the ball. We could have made smarter decisions along the way, but that focus was really, really vital to winning the first Cold War, and we need it back for the second, and we don't have it today. And I'm sorry, I just remembered your question on Canada, and I'll say this really quickly, and then we'll go to the other questions. But I largely adopt Canada's strategy for this new Cold War to contain China, but with one exception. Canada's great insight, and he was a deep Russia guy, and he understood it well, was that the Soviet Union wasn't a natural phenomenon, that one day it would collapse, in large part because it was this amalgamation of ethnic nations that really didn't want to be part of it, the Baltics, the Ukrainians, and so forth. And it played out exactly that way. This is where China is different, because China is not going anywhere. Right? It's been around for 5,000 years. It'll be around for another probably 5,000 or more. And even the CCP, and this is where I disagree with Mike Gallagher and Matt Pottinger, who we both know, that have written recently a piece in Foreign Affairs. Mike Gallagher, the former chairman of the Select Committee on China. Matt Pottinger was Deputy National Security Advisor in the Trump administration for Asia, and they wrote this piece that to win this new Cold War, you have to defeat the CCP. I think that's incredibly dangerous. I think it's also something that is not achievable because there's nothing we can do to destroy the CCP in China. I mean, short of invading China, which no one wants to do. So if you set that as a goal, you may never get there because Chinese Communist Party may survive for hundreds of years. Like, who knows, right? And I don't think that should be the goal. I think the goal should be containing China geographically, militarily, economically, and managing the problem, right? We manage North Korea, we manage Iran, we manage Russia. We'll probably manage China for decades, maybe centuries. As long as we're bigger, as long as we have bigger economic power, as long as we have a bigger military, and as long as we keep them contained within the first island chain, it is doable.
Okay. Next question. Yes, ma'am. Back.
You mentioned military. Considering how few volunteers there are, would you go back to the draft?
No, I mean, no one in the military wants to draft. You want a professional fighting force that is trained, that is equipped. The eras of the drafts are really, I mean, outside of an all-encompassing conflict where you just need bodies, are over. You're seeing the implications of the draft right now in Ukraine, where they're throwing these folks on both sides with a few weeks of training at the trenches and getting them slaughtered, in the World War I style without achieving much territorial gains. You need a professional force that knows what it's doing, and thankfully we have one.
Could you elaborate a bit on exactly how containment plays out in terms of preventing Xi Jinping from realizing his ambition and taking Taiwan? Like, for example, should the American president be specific about our willingness to engage our troops in that fight or not? How could you be more specific about how we accomplish that containment?
Yeah, so that's basically 400 pages of the book, but I'll try to briefly give you a few thoughts. So I actually think the Biden administration has done this very smartly. President Biden has now said on 5 occasions, most recently in the Time magazine piece, that some version of "I will send troops to fight for Taiwan." Virtually every time he's said that, the White House comes out and says our policies of ambiguity does not change. Right? So officially you don't change it, but for a fact that they're paying close attention to this in Beijing, they're paying close attention to this in Taiwan and elsewhere in the region. So it's a great way to do both at the same time. That I think is absolutely intentional. If he had said it once or twice, you could argue it's not, but 5 times now consistently is a sign of something. With regards to deterring invasion, I believe it's completely doable. This place is the worst place you can possibly imagine invading. I talk about this in the book, but the terrain of Taiwan is so hellish for an invader. And in fact, for centuries, as we go through the history, great powers have tried to invade this place, and no one succeeded until the Japanese finally did it in the 1890s through just overwhelming force and obviously overwhelming firepower against the indigenous population there. And last month was the 80th anniversary of a big amphibious invasion, right? D-Day, where 150,000 plus Allied forces crossed the English Channel, which is about the same size as Taiwan Strait, to land on the beaches of Normandy. This year is also the 80th anniversary of another really important amphibious invasion, which never took place. It was called Operation Causeway, and it was put together in August of 1944 by the Joint Chiefs to invade Taiwan. Formosa, as it was called at the time, where you had Japanese forces in direction on it. Viewed even then as a very strategic place on the way to the rest of Japan. And that plan, Operation Causeway, called for 300,000 troops, twice the number of D-Day. Enormous casualties, much greater casualties than we had sustained in the D-Day operation, overlord operation. 2 months of brutal fighting, on that island to capture an island where you had about 100,000 Japanese forces, 6 million population. Today, Taiwan has 24 million people, at least ostensibly, 1 million people in reserves. Quality is a big question, but a lot of people. Defenses in those 80 years have improved dramatically and have given defense an incredible advantage in many ways over offense. So back then it was 300,000, and Roosevelt looked at that plan and said, this is too hard, too costly, too uncertain. We're not going to do this. We're going to go to Okinawa instead, right? So this is very, very difficult to pull off for China. One of the reasons they haven't done it since 1949. And the only reason why there's even a question today that they might be able to do that is because we've dropped our eye off the ball. The Taiwanese have done so. And if we can get there quickly, get them to spend things on the right things, get their military into better shape, if we can enhance our capabilities, I believe this becomes an impossibility because this is that difficult. And the question is, can we do it quickly enough? And do we have the will to do so?
I think we have time for one more quick question before we have to let our.
To what extent do you think the outcome in the Ukraine will have an impact on China's approach to Taiwan?
I don't at all. I don't buy into this tie-in theory. It's a rehash of the domino theory that's been discredited during the First Cold War. And I tend to see that the people that argue for it are the people that don't tend to have any interest in deterring China from invading Taiwan in the first place. And it's a very convenient and intellectually dishonest argument on their part that if you make Russia lose in Ukraine, you deter Xi from invading Taiwan. Look, to deter Xi from invading Taiwan, the obvious thing is to deter Xi from invading Taiwan, right? And not do these, 3 bank shots. And by the way, like, and I believe that we should support Ukraine for the reasons why Ukraine is important and Russian expansion is important, but don't tie it to what's going on in Asia. And if that's the argument, like, where does it stop? Should we make sure that Israel wins in Gaza? Should we, look at every conflict in the world? Because God forbid Xi Jinping will look at that as and read some tea leaves about how that's going to impact deterrence. I think it's nonsense, right? He's going to look at the reality of the Taiwan Strait, the capability of the Taiwanese, our own capabilities, Japanese, and he's going to ask the question, can I do this or not? And that's going to be the overwhelming thing for him to decide to launch this invasion or not, right? What happens halfway around the world in a land war in Europe has very little relevance on that.
Please join me in thanking Dmitri Alperovitch.